History, as it is written, is a grand and often brutalist architecture. It is a structure built of cornerstones, of great wars, of seismic revolutions, of men whose names are carved into the marble of monuments and the pages of textbooks. We walk through its halls and admire the scale, the power, the sheer, undeniable weight of it all. We learn the dates of battles, the lines of treaties, the rise and fall of empires. It is a story of finished things, of lives that had a clear and measurable impact, for good or for ill. Their portraits are complete, framed in gold, their legacies debated but their significance assured. But what of the lives that were not cornerstones, but rather the intricate, fragile frescoes painted on the walls of that great structure? What of the stories that were not finished, the portraits that were left incomplete, their colors still vibrant with promise when the walls themselves began to crumble? These are the narratives that history often forgets, smudged into footnotes or erased entirely by the dust of collapsing worlds. They are the stories of the watchers, the witnesses, the ones who had no hand on the levers of power, but whose hearts were broken by their terrible grinding gears. To find these stories, we must leave the grand halls and venture into the quiet, forgotten corridors of the past. It is here we find the portraits of those whose lives were defined not by what they did, but by what was done to them, whose strength was measured not in victories, but in the quiet, desperate act of endurance. These are often the most profoundly human stories of all, for they speak not of power, but of vulnerability, not of glory, but of grief. Today we seek out one of the most poignant of these unfinished portraits. It is the story of a princess born into the heart of one of history's most formidable and self-assured empires, on the very cusp of the modern age. She was a niece of the last German Kaiser, a young woman groomed from birth for a life of serene, unquestioning privilege, of dynastic duty, and of unimaginable security within the gilded cage of the House of Hohenzollern. Her world was meant to be a perfect, predictable symphony, a childhood of fairy tale palaces, a brilliant marriage to a suitable prince, a life spent as a beloved matriarch, insulated from the harsh realities of the world outside the castle walls. Instead, her life would become a discordant, heartbreaking melody. She would have a storybook wedding on the very eve of the apocalypse, a final glittering masquerade before the lights of her world were extinguished, one by one. She would become a mother in a nation consumed by the madness of a world war, and she would watch as her marriage, her status, her fortune, and her future were systematically dismantled by the forces of history. Her story is not a long, steady reign, but a brief, brilliant flash of promise, followed by a swift and devastating fade into obscurity and tragedy. This is not the chronicle of a queen who shaped an era, but of a woman, a wife, and a mother who was utterly and completely shattered by it. Join us as we piece together the fragile, tragic, and deeply human story of Princess Victoria Margaret of Prussia, the Kaiser's forgotten niece. To truly comprehend the quiet tragedy of Victoria Margaret's life, one must first breathe the air of the world that created her, a world of spectacular, almost suffocating magnificence. She was born on the 17th of April, 1890, a child of the House of Hohenzollern. In the final decade of the 19th century, this was not just a royal family among many. It was the symbolic and literal embodiment of the German Empire, a nation that had, in the space of a single generation, been forged from a collection of disparate states into the single most dominant military and industrial power on the European continent. This was the Wilhelmina era, a period named for its ruler, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and an age of breathtaking, often dizzying contradictions. On one hand, this Germany was a cradle of modernity. Its universities were the envy of the world, producing a torrent of brilliant scientists, philosophers, and thinkers. Its cities, especially Berlin, were exploding with creative energy in art, in architecture, in music, and in literature. It was a nation hurtling forward, powered by the thrumming engines of its factories and the sheer intellectual force of its people. Yet this futuristic, dynamic society was governed by a political and social structure that was, in many ways, fundamentally medieval. At its apex was a rigid, almost feudal aristocracy, dominated by the Prussian Junker class, a landed nobility whose identity was inextricably linked to military service and an austere, unyielding code of honor and obedience. For them, the army was not merely a profession, it was the spiritual center of the state, the ultimate expression of Prussian virtue. This created a society where a university professor might be a global giant in his field, but at a formal dinner, he was of infinitely lower status than a junior lieutenant with a sufficiently ancient family name. And presiding over this complex, often combustible mixture of the ancient and the modern was the Kaiser himself, Victoria Margaret's uncle. Wilhelm II was a man who perfectly embodied his nation's contradictions. He was fascinated by modern technology, by battleships, by industry, by innovation, yet he believed with every fiber of his being in the divine right of kings, the idea that he was God's chosen representative on earth. He was a man of sharp intelligence, yet he was notoriously impulsive, emotionally volatile, and possessed of a staggering insecurity that stemmed in part from a traumatic birth that left him with a withered and near useless left arm. This disability in a culture that worshipped physical prowess and military perfection became the central, secret wound of his life. He spent his entire reign overcompensating for it, projecting an image of hyper-masculine, aggressive strength. He would deliver bombastic, belligerent speeches, rattling his saber and dreaming of a German colonial empire to rival that of his British relatives, all while being a deeply sensitive and often painfully insecure man behind the theatrical facade. Into this world, Princess Victoria Margaret, known intimately within her family as Vima, arrived with a pedigree that placed her at the very heart of this gilded high-stakes stage. Yet her immediate family was a strange and often troubled island within the larger, more conformist Hohenzollern Sea. Her father was Prince Friedrich Leopold of Prussia. He was a grandson of one Prussian king and a second cousin to another, a man of immense wealth and impeccable lineage. But he was anything but a typical stoic Prussian prince. Where men of his class were expected to be disciplined, reserved, and devoted to military duty, Friedrich Leopold was a flamboyant, almost bohemian figure. He was one of an ever-dwindling group of Hohenzollern princes who held a truly vast private fortune, and he used it not to fund regiments, but to indulge his passions. He was an avid and often reckless collector of art, a lover of extravagant travel, and the host of opulent parties. He built a magnificent hunting lodge that was more of a pleasure palace, and he was known for his sharp, often bitingly witty tongue. Most dangerously, he harbored a thinly veiled disdain for the minutiae of military life, and frequently clashed with his cousin, the Kaiser. While Wilhelm II was performing the role of the supreme warlord, Friedrich Leopold was playing the part of the Grand Seigneur, a man who believed his privilege was best used for personal enjoyment. This made him a constant source of irritation and suspicion at a court that valued conformity above all else. His rebelliousness was not political but personal, a stubborn refusal to be molded into the stiff, uniform figure of a proper Prussian prince. Weima's mother was Princess Louise Sophie of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Augustenburg. If her husband was a force of chaotic, self-indulgent energy, Louise Sophie was his temperamental opposite. She was a woman known for her quiet piety, her gentle and unassuming demeanor, and her profound devotion to her family and her duties. Her position at court was both one of immense privilege and intense, unremitting difficulty. She was the younger sister of Empress Augusta Victoria, the Kaiser's wife. This familial bond made her the Kaiserin's closest friend and confidant, a position of great informal power and influence. But it also meant she was perpetually caught in the middle, forced to act as a buffer and mediator between her fiercely loyal sister, who defended her husband the Kaiser in all things, and her own difficult, often insubordinate husband. One can only imagine the sheer diplomatic tightrope she had to walk daily, trying to soothe the Kaiser's famously thin skin after some fresh outrage from her husband, all while maintaining the peace within her own home. She was a woman living in a state of constant, low-grade emotional crisis. Victoria Margaret and her 3 younger brothers grew up in this unique and uniquely stressful environment. Their primary residence was Glinica Palais, a stunning neoclassical villa on the outskirts of Potsdam, the spiritual and military heart of the Prussian kingdom. Glinica was not a typical forbidding Prussian palace. It was a romantic Mediterranean-style fantasy, designed by the great architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel to look like an Italian villa on the shores of Lake Como. It was surrounded by lush, sprawling gardens, dotted with classical follies, fountains, and pergolas. It was a personal, idyllic paradise, a world away from the rigid formality of the main court in Berlin and the Spartan atmosphere of the Potsdam barracks. Here, in this bubble of aesthetic beauty, Weima's childhood unfolded. It was, on the surface, the stuff of fairy tales, a life of private tutors, ponies, endless summer afternoons in the garden, and the deep cellular unquestioned assumption that her world of servants, of deference, of immense wealth was as solid, natural, and permanent as the palace's stone walls. Yet this gilded childhood was lived in the shadow of her family's complicated reputation. Her father's extravagant spending and his frequent ill-advised arguments with the Kaiser were a constant source of court gossip. He was seen as unreliable, undisciplined, a problem prince. This likely instilled in the young princess a very different set of values, a common reaction for a child of a flamboyant and controversial parent. Where her father was loud, she became quiet. Where he was rebellious, she became the model of dutiful obedience. Where he craved attention, she learned the art of graceful discretion. She was absorbing the lessons of her mother's life, how to navigate difficult, powerful male personalities, how to maintain a serene and placid composure amidst unspoken but ever-present tensions. She was said to have inherited her mother's gentle nature and her deep, almost solemn sense of responsibility. Physically, she was every inch the Hohenzollern princess, tall, slender, with the regal bearing and formal elegance that was expected of her station. But observers noted a certain quietness, a watchful, observant quality, and perhaps even a touch of melancholy in her demeanor. She was being polished and prepared for the only real career available to a woman of her rank and time, to be a perfect royal bride. She was a dynastic asset, a beautiful and well-bred pawn to be used in the great, intricate game of European royal matchmaking. As she blossomed from a girl into a young woman, the question hanging over her life was not if she would marry, but who the chosen prince would be. Her life had been a beautiful cage of gold and shadow, and soon its door would be opened just long enough for her to step from the familiar confines of her father's house into the unknown territory of her husband's. In the gilded ecosystem of European royalty before the cataclysm of 1914, a marriage was rarely the culmination of a romance. It was a strategic merger, a cold and calculated transaction of bloodlines, territory, and political influence. For a princess as highly placed as Victoria Margaret, a niece of the German Kaiser, a daughter of one of the wealthiest houses in the empire, the selection of a husband was a matter of state. He had to be a man of impeccable lineage, of appropriate rank, and, crucially, of a political and personal profile that would complement and enhance the interests of the German Empire and the House of Hohenzollern. After careful consideration, the man selected for her was Prince Heinrich, 33, Reuss of Köstritz. On the surface, and indeed beneath it, he was a perfect choice. The House of Reuss was one of Germany's most ancient and respected noble families, a dynasty that had ruled parts of Thuringia for centuries. They were famous for a peculiar but deeply symbolic family tradition. For over 800 years, every male child born into the house was named Heinrich and was then numbered consecutively, starting again at 1 at the beginning of each new century. This tradition spoke of continuity, of order, of a deep and abiding connection to history. Prince Heinrich 33 was the very embodiment of these qualities. He was not a flashy military man in the typical Prussian mold. He was a serious, intelligent, and distinguished figure who had pursued a career in the diplomatic service, serving at the German embassy in the crucial and delicate post of Paris. He was seen as a man of the world, urbane, experienced, and possessed of a quiet gravitas. He was handsome in a severe, aristocratic way, universally respected, and, most importantly, he was seen as a steady, reliable, and deeply conventional figure, a psychological and temperamental antidote to Wima's flamboyant and unpredictable father. For a young woman who had been raised in a home of unspoken tensions and parental eccentricities, the prospect of a life with such a stable and reassuringly normal man must have seemed like a safe and welcome harbor. The private details of their courtship are, as was common for the era, lost to history. Royal emotions were not for public consumption, but it was declared an eminently suitable match by all parties. For the Kaiser, it was a respectable alliance that solidified ties within the highest echelons of the German aristocracy, a sensible and uncontroversial union. For Wima's parents, it secured a dignified and prosperous future for their only daughter. And for Victoria Margaret herself, it was the fulfillment of the destiny that had been laid out for her since birth. On the 17th of May, 1913, in the imperial capital of Berlin, they were married. One must pause and try to conjure the scene, for this was not just a wedding. It was a spectacular, almost defiant display of the power, wealth, and serene self-confidence of the German Empire in its final sun-drenched summer of peace. The grand boulevards of Berlin, a city that had been transformed into a modern metropolis of stone and steel, would have been lined with cheering crowds, a sea of faces turned up to watch the procession. The streets would be festooned with the black, white, and red banners of the imperial flag. The guest list was a roll call of the great royal and noble houses of Germany and beyond. The ceremony itself, likely held in the Berlin Cathedral or the Royal Palace Chapel, would have been a dazzling affair, a sensory overload of imperial splendor. Imagine a cavernous space, heavy with the scent of lilies and incense, lit by the glittering reflection of 1,000 candles on polished steel and gold. A sea of glittering diamond tiaras, magnificent, brightly colored military uniforms, dripping with medals and gold braid, and priceless jewels adorning the necks of princesses and duchesses. And at the very center of this grand theatrical production was the 23-year-old princess, Victoria Margaret. She would have been a vision of bridal purity and aristocratic elegance, walking down the aisle to meet her handsome waiting prince. She was stepping into the future that had been so meticulously planned for her, a future that seemed to promise a lifetime of serenity, duty, and quiet happiness. The formal portraits taken on that day are profoundly, almost painfully, poignant to view now. They depict a world of supreme, almost arrogant self-assurance, a civilization at its absolute zenith of power and convinced of its own permanence. The men, the Kaiser, the princes, the generals, stand ramrod straight, their chests puffed out, covered in medals, their expressions a mask of stern, martial confidence. The women are adorned in the finest lace and silk, their postures perfect, the very picture of serene, untouchable elegance. They are all flawlessly playing their assigned parts in the grand, centuries-old theater of monarchy, completely and blissfully oblivious to the fact that the magnificent stage they stood upon was riddled with dry rot and about to collapse into a fiery abyss. The wedding of Victoria Margaret was, in many ways, the last grand ball on the Titanic. It was the final, defiant, joyous celebration of an old world order that, in just over a year's time, would be dead and gone forever, consumed by the fires of the Great War. For a brief, fleeting period, however, the promise of that sunlit day in May seemed to hold true. Vima and Heinrich settled into their new life as a princely couple. They were wealthy, they were prestigious, and they were, by all outward appearances, a model aristocratic pair. The princess dutifully fulfilled her next great responsibility, the provision of heirs to carry on the ancient family line. Their first child, a daughter they named Marie-Louise, was born in March of 1915. A son, Heinrich II, followed in November of 1916. But the intimate personal joy of these births was tragically and completely overshadowed by the world into which these children were born. By the time Marie-Louise arrived, the war that had erupted in August 1914 was already 7 months old. The naive, almost giddy optimism of its first weeks, the belief that the soldiers would be home by Christmas, had dissolved into the brutal, soul-crushing reality of trench warfare. Vima's children were born into a Germany that was no longer celebrating glorious advances, but was beginning to feel the immense grinding strain of total war. The initial patriotic fervor had given way to a grim, stoic determination, punctuated by the first signs of food shortages and the ever-lengthening casualty lists that were being posted in every town and village across the land. Prince Heinrich, as a man of his class and a former diplomat, was immediately and deeply involved in the war effort. He was part of the vast, impersonal machine of a modern war. Victoria Margaret, like millions of other women across Europe, was transformed overnight. She was no longer just a princess. She became a soldier on the home front. Her new reality was a life of profound anxiety and fear, a life spent trying to raise 2 small children in a world filled with terrifying uncertainty, waiting for letters and telegrams from a husband engaged in a conflict that was tearing her continent and her own extended royal family apart. The fairy tale had ended almost as soon as it had begun. The safe, placid harbor she had married into was now caught in the dead center of the deadliest and most destructive storm in all of human history. The First World War did more than just redraw the political map of Europe and annihilate a generation of young men. It redrew the emotional and psychological maps of the people who survived it. It carved a deep, unbridgeable chasm between the world before 1914, a world of structure, of certainty, of known rules, and the chaotic, traumatized world that came after. It was a gap in experience and understanding that many couples whose relationships had been forged in the old world found they could not cross together. For Princess Victoria Margaret and Prince Heinrich, the war that systematically destroyed the empire they served also seems to have fatally and inexorably wounded their marriage. While the exact intimate details of their marital breakdown are lost to the discretion of a past that did not document such private sorrows, we can piece together a powerful and tragic narrative from the brutal circumstances they were forced to endure. Before the war, their union was based on the solid foundation of a shared world, a world of imperial certainty, of rigid social hierarchies, and of clearly defined complementary roles. He was the stoic diplomat and prince, a man of affairs and duty. She was the dutiful princess, wife, and mother, the serene center of the domestic sphere. Their lives were scripted, their futures secure. The war took that script, tore it into pieces, and set it on fire. Heinrich, like every man of his generation and class, was consumed by the conflict. Whether he was serving on the front lines, or more likely given his background, in a high-level administrative or diplomatic role within the military apparatus, he was an integral part of the vast soul-numbing machine of modern industrial warfare. He would have witnessed or been party to decisions that involved life and death on a previously unimaginable scale. This kind of experience changes a man fundamentally. It can breed a hard, pragmatic cynicism that has little patience for the nuances of civilian life. The concerns of the home front, the anxieties, the emotional strains can seem trivial, almost self-indulgent, to a man who has been dealing with casualty reports and logistical nightmares. The trauma, the moral compromises, the sheer mental and physical exhaustion of participating in such a cataclysm can build thick, impenetrable walls around a person's heart, making them distant, hardened, and perhaps unrecognizable to those who knew and loved them before. The man who returned from the war was almost never the same man who had marched away. Meanwhile, Victoria Margaret was living through a very different but equally stressful and transformative war. Hers was not a war of violent, punctuated crises, but one of slow, corrosive attrition. It was a war against fear, against hunger, and against a profound, creeping loneliness. She was largely isolated, bearing the immense responsibility for her two small children, in a nation that was slowly but surely starving under the tightening vice of the British naval blockade. The winter of 1916-17 became known as the Turnip Winter, a time of desperate, gnawing hunger when the German population was forced to survive on coarse bread made with sawdust and the unpalatable turnip. For a princess, this would have meant a reduction in luxury, but for the nation around her, it was a time of genuine deprivation and growing civil unrest. She would have seen the faces of the hungry in the streets, a constant grim reminder of how fragile her own protected world had become. The letters and official news from the front would have been a source of constant sickening terror. Every knock on the door, every unexpected footstep in the hall could be a telegram bearing the worst possible news. This creates a state of perpetual high-strung anxiety, a nervous exhaustion that is profoundly different from the soldier's experience, but no less damaging to the soul. Furthermore, the very foundation of her identity was shaken to its core. The world she had been raised in, an intricate web of interconnected royal cousins who ruled Europe, was now a grotesque, continent-spanning death match. This wasn't an abstract political idea for her. It was a daily personal agony. Her British relatives, descendants of Queen Victoria just as she was, were now the hated enemy. Imagine her, sitting in a drawing room in Potsdam, reading a German newspaper, trumpeting a victory on the Somme. The words would speak of national glory, but she would know with a sickening certainty that the dead and wounded on the other side were the subjects of her cousin, King George V. She might have looked at old family photographs from gatherings at Windsor Castle, remembering a shared childhood laugh with people who were now officially her mortal enemies, their faces used in propaganda posters to stoke the hatred of her own people. The Russian Tsar, another relative, was leading a nation locked in a fight to the death with her own. This bizarre and tragic reality, this cousins' war, meant that for Vima, there was no such thing as a pure victory. Every German advance was a loss for another part of her family, another tear in the fabric of her own identity. The entire basis of her life, the pan-European aristocracy, was committing a slow, bloody, and spectacular suicide, and she had a front-row seat. She was a Hohenzollern princess in a Germany that was beginning to lose faith in its Hohenzollern leaders, a mother whose children's future was being gambled away in the blood-soaked mud of Flanders and the forests of the Eastern Front. This profound divergence of experience is a classic textbook recipe for marital estrangement. When the war finally ended in a shocking and humiliating defeat for Germany in November 1918, it did not bring a joyful, tearful reunion for the couple, but rather a final, brutal reckoning with a devastating new reality. Germany was defeated, broken, and starving. The Kaiser had abdicated and fled into a lonely, ignominious exile in Holland. The monarchy, which had stood for 1,000 years, was abolished overnight with a stroke of a pen. Vima and Heinrich were no longer a prince and princess of a triumphant, powerful empire. They were suddenly just Mr. and Mrs. Roos, relics of a despised and discredited regime, private citizens in the new, chaotic, and bitterly impoverished Weimar Republic. The psychological shock of this defeat, especially for a man of Heinrich's class, cannot be overstated. The Prussian aristocracy was built on a foundational myth of military invincibility. Defeat was not just a political or strategic outcome. It was an existential crisis, a deep spiritual wound. In their circles, the poisonous Dolchstoßlegende, the stab-in-the-back myth, would have taken immediate and fervent root. This was the belief that the German army had not been defeated on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by treacherous politicians, communists, and Jews on the home front. This narrative, while false, was a comforting balm for a shattered national ego, and it created an atmosphere of paranoia, bitterness, and a desperate search for scapegoats. This was the toxic air they were now breathing. For a man like Heinrich, the loss of status and the humiliation of defeat would have been a daily, gnawing dishonor. All the external scaffolding that had held their marriage together, their titles, their social duties, their shared status, their role in the grand imperial project, was violently ripped away. They were left with nothing but each other, two people who had been profoundly and permanently changed by 4 years of unimaginable national and personal trauma, now facing a future of complete and terrifying uncertainty. It is in this bleak, ash-strewn aftermath that the hairline cracks in their relationship seem to have widened into an unbridgeable canyon. Perhaps the stoic, formal, and emotionally reserved man she had married now seemed cold, distant, and unfeeling in the face of their shared loss and fear. His likely preoccupation with the national dishonor and the political chaos may have left little room for her more personal domestic grief. Perhaps, from his perspective, her anxieties and grief were an indulgence in a world that now demanded a hard, pragmatic focus on simple survival. We will never know the words they exchanged in the privacy of their now diminished household, but their actions speak for them. What we do know for a certainty is that by the early 1920s, the marriage was over in all but name. They formally and legally divorced on the 14th of July, 1922. We must pause to fully consider how radical, how shocking, and how socially ruinous this step was. For a niece of the former Kaiser, a woman raised in the deeply conservative, religious, and patriarchal world of the Prussian aristocracy, divorce was not just a personal sadness. It was a profound public disgrace. It was a stain on the family honor, a catastrophic admission of a personal failure that would have been whispered about with a mixture of pity and contempt in the drawing rooms of the exiled and dispossessed nobility. This was not a modern, no-fault proceeding. It was a messy, often fault-based process that required one party to essentially accept public blame. It meant facing the disapproval of her parents, her brothers, and what remained of her social circle. It was an act that would have finalized her isolation, cutting her off from the very people she might have turned to for support. The fact that they went through with it suggests that their unhappiness was not merely a mild incompatibility or a gentle drifting apart. It implies a deep and painful rift, a level of misery that made continuing the charade of their marriage simply impossible to bear. For Vima, it must have been an act of sheer desperation, a choice made when the alternative, a life sentence in a cold, loveless union, trapped with a man who was now a stranger to her, was a fate worse than public disgrace. It speaks to a quiet, hidden strength, a refusal to completely submit even when all the forces of her society and upbringing were screaming at her to endure in silence. The divorce, in the end, was not the primary cause of Victoria Margaret's tragedy. It was a symptom of it. It was the final, intensely personal consequence of the great public cataclysm of the war. Her marriage, like the glorious empire she was born into, had become another silent casualty of the conflict, a beautiful promise of a peaceful, orderly, and love-filled life that had been broken beyond any hope of repair. At the age of 32, Victoria Margaret was now a divorcee, a single mother of 2 young children, and a princess with no kingdom, adrift and alone in the wreckage of her former world. The final year of Princess Victoria, Margaret's life, is a story of profound dislocation, quiet desperation, and a steady, heartbreaking unraveling. To be a divorced royal princess in the Germany of 1922 was to occupy a strange, lonely, and socially ambiguous space. She was a woman who had been systematically stripped of the 2 central pillars that had defined her entire existence: her royal status and her role as a wife. The violent tide of revolution had swept away the first, and the slow, corrosive poison of trauma and estrangement had destroyed the second. For a woman raised from the cradle to believe her value was intrinsically tied to these 2 roles, their sudden absence would have created a terrifying void, a crisis of identity at the very core of her being. She was no longer a public figure, but she was not truly a private citizen either. She was a ghost, haunting the ruins of her own life. Following the divorce, she found herself back in her childhood home, Glinica Palace. But the palace was no longer the sun-drenched, idyllic setting of her youth. It was now just a large, cold, and impossibly expensive house to maintain. It was a magnificent, echoing mausoleum to a lost world, every neoclassical column and every manicured garden path, a painful, constant reminder of the life of certainty and privilege that had been stolen from her. Imagine her walking through those grand, silent rooms where she had once played as a girl, rooms that had once buzzed with the activity of dozens of servants. Now dust sheets would have covered the fine furniture, the air would be still and cold to save on heating fuel, and her own footsteps would echo back at her, a lonely sound in the cavernous space. The laughter of her childhood, the memory of the glittering parties, the hopeful preparations for her own wedding. All these memories would now be ghosts, taunting her with the specter of a life that had been promised and then cruelly snatched away. The palace was no longer a home. It was a daily confrontation with loss. And beyond its ornate gates, the nation was descending into a new circle of hell. Germany was in the grips of a catastrophic, almost surreal, hyperinflation crisis. The nation's economy had completely and utterly collapsed. It is difficult for us now to truly grasp the scale of this economic apocalypse. This was not a recession. It was the total disintegration of a modern industrial economy, a complete breakdown of the very concept of money. The German mark, which had been a stable gold-backed currency for decades, became utterly worthless. People's life savings, painstakingly accumulated over generations, were wiped out in a matter of weeks, then days, then hours. The value of money evaporated so quickly that prices would change multiple times a day. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily so they could rush out and spend their wages at lunchtime before the notes became worthless by dinner time. The stories from this period sound like absurdist fiction, but they were the grim reality. People pushing wheelbarrows piled high with worthless banknotes just to buy a single loaf of bread. Children using stacks of cash as building blocks because they were cheaper than actual toys. People burning money in their stoves for heat because it was more economical than buying firewood. But beneath these famous images lay a deeper, more corrosive social decay. Trust evaporated. Bartering replaced commerce. Farmers refused to bring produce to the cities, leading to widespread hunger. The social fabric, woven together by a shared understanding of value and obligation, was tearing apart at the seams. This economic cataclysm had a devastating social impact. It destroyed the middle class, the bedrock of any stable society, and it fueled the rise of political extremism on both the left and the right, as desperate people flocked to any demagogue who promised a simple solution. It plunged millions into a state of desperate, humiliating poverty. For the aristocracy, who had already lost their lands in many cases, their titles, and their political power, this was the final, crushing blow. Any remaining financial assets they had, stocks, bonds, bank accounts, were rendered as worthless as the paper they were printed on. Even for a family as historically wealthy as Vima's, the strain must have been immense. The very foundations of society had crumbled. The old codes of conduct, the deference and respect she would have been shown her entire life as a matter of birthright, had vanished, replaced by the raw, desperate, and often ugly struggle for simple survival that defined the early Weimar years. In the breadlines, a princess was just another hungry mouth. One can only speculate on her state of mind during this terrifying period, but it must have been a landscape of unrelenting anxiety. She was a single mother to two very young children, Marie-Louise, now age 7, and Heinrich, age 6. In the eyes of the law and society, she was now solely responsible for their well-being and their future. This was a radical departure from the aristocratic motherhood she had been raised to expect, a role buffered by a small army of nannies, governesses, and tutors. Now the daily, intimate, and exhausting work of raising children in a time of crisis fell squarely on her shoulders. How do you explain to a child why there isn't enough to eat? How do you create a bubble of security and love for them when their own world has been shattered by divorce and the world outside is descending into chaos? She had to be their rock, their constant, even as the ground beneath her own feet was turning to quicksand. Added to this immense public stress was the intensely private humiliation and grief of her recent divorce. In the deeply conservative circles of the German nobility, Divorce was not seen as an unfortunate personal tragedy, but as a moral failing, particularly on the part of the woman. She would have been socially ostracized, the subject of cruel gossip and pitying glances. Old friends would have grown distant, invitations would have dried up. She was now damaged goods, a woman who had failed in her primary duty. Her ex-husband, Heinrich, as a man, had the freedom to move on, to rebuild his life, perhaps even to remarry and create a new, respectable family. But for Vima, the future must have looked terrifyingly blank, a lonely and featureless landscape. She was trapped by her gender, her class, and her circumstances. She was surrounded by ghosts. The ghost of the glorious empire she was born to serve, the ghost of her own failed marriage, and the ghost of the secure, predictable future she had been promised from the cradle. At the age of 33, an age when many women are just beginning to feel truly settled in their lives, her own life had been completely and utterly unraveled, thread by thread. There is a profound sense of isolation that emanates from her story at this point. Her uncle, the once mighty Kaiser, was a reviled and increasingly irrelevant exile in Holland, a source of national shame, not support. The old glittering court society of her youth was scattered to the winds, impoverished or dead. The very people who should have formed her support network were themselves struggling to survive, caught in their own private tragedies. She was, in a very real and terrifying sense, completely alone, a relic of a bygone age trapped in a hostile and unforgiving present. It was in this state of profound physical, emotional, and spiritual vulnerability that fate, which had already been so cruel to her, decided to deal its final merciless blow. In the late summer of 1923, as the hyperinflation crisis reached its insane peak and the first chills of autumn began to creep into the unheated rooms of Glinica Palace, she fell ill with influenza. Normally, for a healthy young woman, this would have been a miserable but ultimately survivable illness. But the world was still living in the shadow of the horrific Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920, which had killed tens of millions of people worldwide, far more than the war itself. The flu was deeply and rightfully feared. It could strike with shocking speed and lethality, especially in populations that were already weakened by years of malnutrition, stress, and psychological trauma. And Victoria Margaret was undoubtedly weakened. The cumulative, relentless toll of the past decade was a debt her body could no longer pay. Think of it as a form of spiritual and physical bankruptcy. The constant, low-grade anxiety of the war years, the shock and humiliation of defeat, the abolition of her entire world, the intensely personal trauma of her divorce, and now the daily grinding anxiety of life in a collapsing society, all of it had left her spirit and her body utterly depleted. The official historical records state, with clinical brevity, that she died from complications of influenza. But this sterile medical phrase masks a deeper, more tragic truth. It is highly likely that she simply did not have the physical or perhaps even the spiritual reserves left to fight it off. Her will to live, that mysterious, unquantifiable force that sees people through the darkest of times, may have been systematically eroded by a decade of unrelenting loss. She was left defenseless against the final, opportunistic assault of a common virus. Her body, in the end, simply mirrored the state of her nation, broken, exhausted, and with no strength left to resist. On the 9th of September 1923, just over a year after her divorce, Princess Victoria Margaret of Prussia died at Glinica Palace. She was 33 years old. Her death was not a grand state event. There were no national days of mourning, no lengthy obituaries. in international newspapers. In a Germany reeling from chaos and death, where life had become cheap, the passing of a minor divorced princess was barely a ripple. To the world, she was just another victim of a common illness in a time of widespread, anonymous suffering. But her death was the quiet, tragic, and strangely fitting conclusion to a life that serves as a perfect, heartbreaking microcosm of her era. She was born at the absolute zenith of an empire's power and died in its deepest pit of despair, a princess who had been given everything and had lost it all before she ever truly had a chance to live. When a life is cut so tragically and prematurely short, its legacy is often found not in a list of accomplishments or in monuments of stone, but in the fragile human threads that are left behind. For Victoria Margaret, her most immediate and enduring legacy was her 2 young children, who were now, in the space of a little over a year, the products of a broken home and now motherless. Marie Louisa was only 8 years old, and Heinrich was just 6. They were now placed in the full and permanent care of their father, Prince Heinrich 33 Reuss, and they would grow up in a world that their mother would not have recognized, a world she was spared from seeing. Their childhoods were not spent in the secure, sunlit gardens of an imperial palace, but in the turbulent, violent, and deeply uncertain landscape of interwar Germany. They lived through the brief, glittering, and decadent stabilization of the Weimar Republic in the mid-1920s, only to see it all come crashing down again in the Great Depression. They then witnessed, as teenagers, the terrifying and seductive rise of the Nazi Party, the establishment of the Third Reich, and the nation's subsequent descent into an even greater and more horrific moral and physical abyss. They lived through the horrors of the Second World War, and then the bitter aftermath of Germany's second catastrophic defeat, its division, and the long, tense twilight of the Cold War. They lived remarkably quiet, intensely private lives, far from the public spotlight that had shone so briefly and so brightly on their mother's wedding day. They were the inheritors of a great and ancient name, but also of a profound and personal tragedy. Princess Marie Louise eventually married and had children of her own, living a long life until her death in 1985. Prince Heinrich II, the little boy who lost his mother at the age of 6, lived until 1993. They were the living vessels of their mother's memory, a fragile human link back to the lost world of the German Empire. Through their quiet survival, her story did not entirely vanish into the ether of the past. But what is the broader significance of Victoria Margaret's life? Beyond her own children, why does her short, sad story still hold the power to move us? And why does it still matter? It matters primarily because it powerfully and unforgettably humanizes history. We are taught history as a grand, impersonal narrative, a story of armies, treaties, ideologies, and economic forces. We speak of the collapse of the German Empire as an abstract historical event, a chapter in a textbook. But Weimar's story forces us to remember that these grand historical forces have deeply, painfully personal consequences. The collapse of an empire was also the collapse of a marriage. The humiliation of a nation was also the private, silent pain of a young woman losing her home, her identity, her security, and her future. Her life is a testament to the fact that history is something that is felt in individual human hearts. She also represents a lost generation of aristocratic women whose lives were utterly and completely derailed by the First World War. This was a generation of women raised for a single specific purpose in a world of rigid, almost geological certainties. They were groomed to be beautiful, dutiful, and serene ornaments of a stable hierarchical society. And then, Almost overnight, they were thrown into an age of violent, unpredictable chaos. They were educated to manage great households, not to scrimp and save in an era of hyperinflation. They were trained in etiquette, not in the brutal art of survival. They were not generals or politicians. They had no power to stop the cataclysm that was unfolding around them. They were, in many ways, history's silent witnesses, and all too often, its silent victims. Vima's story is the archetypal story of them all. Furthermore, her life serves as a powerful and humbling reminder that immense privilege is, in the end, no shield at all against the most profound forms of human tragedy. She was born with every material and social advantage imaginable, immense wealth, an ancient title, a revered social status, but none of it, not one piece of it, could protect her from the historical forces that tore her world apart, nor from the intimate heartbreak of a failed marriage, nor from the simple, indiscriminate virus that ultimately claimed her life. Her story gently but firmly dismantles the fantasy that a fairy tale beginning guarantees a happy ending. It reminds us of the profound fragility of human existence, a fragility that binds the princess in her palace to the peasant in the field. Perhaps the most important reason her story continues to resonate is because it is so achingly incomplete. We have the basic facts of her life, the dates, the names, the events, but the emotional truth, her innermost thoughts, her deepest fears, her final fading hopes, are lost to us forever. She left no diaries, no cache of revealing letters. Her inner world is a mystery, and this very incompleteness forces us to engage with her story not as passive observers of historical fact, but as active, empathetic interpreters. It forces us to ask the questions that lie at the heart of the human experience. What must it have felt like? How did she cope with so much loss in such a short and brutal span of time? In trying to answer these questions, in trying to imagine our way into her heart and mind, we connect with her on a deeply human level. She ceases to be just a name in a dusty genealogical chart and becomes a person whose pain we can almost feel across the silent, unbridgeable chasm of a century. In the end, we are left with the haunting image of an unfinished portrait. The early strokes laid down in the confident, optimistic years before the war are clear, precise, and bright. A serene princess in a fairy tale palace, a radiant bride in a spectacular imperial wedding. The artist was painting a life of assured and serene greatness. But as the portrait continues, as the canvas moves from 1913 to 1923, the lines become blurred and hesitant, the colors darken and bleed into one another, and the background dissolves from the sharp, clear light of gilded ballrooms into the murky, indistinct gray ruins of a broken and starving nation. And then abruptly it simply stops. The artist's brush was put down far too soon. The most important parts of the face, the wisdom of age, the peace of resolution, left unpainted forever. The life of Princess Victoria Margaret of Prussia is not a cautionary tale. It does not offer a grand moral lesson about the hubris of empires or the follies of the aristocracy. It is something quieter, more intimate, and far more profound. It is a story of quiet dignity in the face of relentless, overwhelming despair. It is a testament to the immense, often invisible continent of suffering that ripples just beneath the surface of great historical events. She did not change the course of history in any meaningful way, but her life was irrevocably, cruelly, and tragically changed by it. To remember her, to tell her story, is to perform a small but necessary act of historical justice. It is to deliberately look past the famous names, the thundering cannons, and the headline events, and to acknowledge the immense human cost of our collective past. It is to retrieve a forgotten, fragile story from the shadows of history and to see in it a poignant reflection of the universal human experiences of love, of loss, and of the desperate, quiet struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems to offer none. She was a daughter of the last German Empire, a bride in its final glittering summer, and a mother in its devastating endless winter. She was a woman who was promised a world of perfect, unshakable stability, and was given instead a world of relentless, soul-crushing chaos. Her crown was ephemeral, her marriage was broken, and her life was a tragically brief and unfinished symphony. But in rescuing her story from the silence of obscurity, we do more than just remember a forgotten princess. We remember a fundamental truth, that every footnote in every history book was once a living, breathing, feeling person with a story of their own that is worth telling. And in the quiet, forgotten gallery of the past, the unfinished portrait of Victoria Margaret of Prussia finally gets the thoughtful, empathetic, and compassionate gaze it has always deserved.